Let's talk about filters. There are two scenarios that we should think about when using a filter. The first is where we just add a filter into the filters area on the pivot table. We can also filter directly on the pivot table, and this covers the second scenario, where we've got the option to filter both labels and values. The interface is more flexible here, giving the ability to say choose cities that contain the word San in them, or filter on the values, say the lowest 20% of my sales value. Okay, here we are back in Excel, and I've got a couple of pivot tables on this single worksheet here. The pivot table that I'm actually going to be using for this initial filter is for the one that is listing cities and product sizes, small, medium, large, etc. Let's go and add a product filter to this pivot table. So I'll just drag the product field into the filters area there, and you can see that it's created a filter for me in the row above the pivot table. So if I wanted to just filter for Americanos, then I could just select that product. Alternatively, I could select this checkbox and select multiple items. I can, of course, add multiple filters into a pivot table, so I could choose to have a look at all of the decaf coffee sales as well. So that deals with adding filters onto a pivot table. One thing to note is that filters are specific to any one particular pivot table. Let's have a look at applying some filters to the labels and the values field. If I come over to this first pivot table and click on the button here, then you can see I've got the ability to use these check boxes to select individual labels to filter on. Alternatively, I can use some logical label filters here. So let me apply a filter where the label contains the word San. And so you can see that that particular pivot table is now filtered to San Antonio, San Diego, and San Jose. I'm going to clear the filter from city, and then I'm going to add a value filter. So let's just say I wanted to filter where the price is greater than $20,000. So in this case, you can see the cities Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York meet that criteria. What about slicers then? Well, a standard slicer is a set of interactive clickable buttons that you can select, deselect, or even multi-select, and they're used to add interactivity onto a pivot table. Another type of slicer is the timeline slicer, which, as you'd expect, allows you to home in on a period of time. What's also nice about slicers is that you can apply a single slicer to multiple pivot tables in a worksheet. If I was to set up multiple slicers for multiple pivot tables, I'd be sure to provide some sort of visual grouping, as I've done using color in this image. Okay, I'm back in Excel, and let's go ahead and insert a slicer that is going to work on this first pivot table. So you can see I'm presented with the Insert Slicers dialog box, and listed there are the complete list of columns in my pivot table. Let me choose to create a slicer using the coffee type. So let's just say I only wanted to see the sales of flat white coffee. The pivot table changes, and of course, if I want to go and explore some other data, then I could select the relevant coffee type. If I want to multi-select, then I can control and click, and the slicer selections are applied to the pivot table. If I want to clear the selection, I can select this button. And if I select this button to multi-select, then once something is selected, it's a single click to deselect it. Now, because I've got this slicer selected, I also have a slicer tab in the ribbon. Within that tab, you can see I could change the slicer options. So I could change the name of the slicer, access and change other settings, including the sort order. I can change the slicer's style, change the arrangement of the slicer on the worksheet, modify the size of buttons and the size of the slicer itself. Let's just actually zone in and have a look at the report connections option. At the moment, you can see this slicer, which is called coffee type, is associated with pivot table 1 on the slicers tab, but isn't yet associated with pivot table 2, this pivot table here. So if I want to associate it with the second pivot table, I need to come in and select the pivot table to associate it with. You'll see that when I click OK, then the data in this second pivot table also changes. So when I make a change to the slicer derives the data in both of the pivot tables, and that's pretty neat. Let's go and create a timeline slicer then. I'm going to click on the second pivot table so that pivot table's fields are displayed for me. Now, to create a timeline slicer, I could click here and say Insert Timeline, but alternatively, I can insert a slicer directly from the pivot table list here by right-clicking on the item that I want to have as a slicer, and then towards the bottom, I can either add a slicer or, if it's a recognized date field, add as a timeline. Now, you can see I've got dates from 2022 right up until the end of 2025 in my timeline. The timeline is very simple to use. If I just wanted to see information for February 2022, I could select on the timeline for February. If I wanted to drag the timeline to select February to August, then I could do that as well. In this drop down here, you can choose the granularity of data. So if months is too granular, then we could choose quarters or years. One thing that I can't do in the timeline is select non-contiguous periods. So I can't select 2022 and 2024 and exclude 2023. In terms of formatting the timeline, let's have a look at that. I have a timeline caption, so instead of date, I could enter something like sales period. I've got the same report connections that we had for regular slicers. I could choose a different timeline style, and I've got the opportunity to change the height and width of the timeline, whether I display the header or not, whether I display the scroll bar at the bottom, whether I choose to display the selection label, and whether I choose to display the time level. Finally, if I want to remove any slicer, I can highlight it and press the delete key, or I can right click on the slicer and remove it that way.